The idea behind this video is to show you ways of organizing your scene and selecting objects within the scene. Now, if you've never set up a default scene for Bryce to launch to, then it will probably look like this when you launch Bryce. And we're looking at the moment from the director's camera view here. That icon tells you we're in the director's camera view, and this is the perspective camera, and these grey dotted lines are its field of view, and this grid on the floor is the infinite plane. If I use the keyboard shortcut 2 to switch to the overhead view, you see the camera's body is a sort of a green colour and this plane is grey. That's the default setup for anything you create. So if I create a terrain now, for example, and then I'll just it's come in selected, but I'll click off to one side and deselect it. We've now got the terrain over this infinite plane, and that has also been assigned a grey colour, and the colours are the family groupings. Before I go into assigning families, I just want to point out that I don't feel this position for the perspective camera is particularly helpful. So if I click on that, left click, that's selected, and then I can just drag it to a new position. And then using the edit controls, I'm going to rotate it round to face what I call north. The reason for placing it in this position is because if I go to sky and fog here, the sun rollerball, that's the sun overhead, is aligned so that that is north, south, east, west. So we can place the sun in view on the horizon by doing that keyboard shortcut 1 to switch to the perspective camera view, and that will show, that's in the nano preview there, that the sun's coming in on the north. Back to overhead view 2. Likewise, right, if I click on this now, so that's just left click, you see it's selected the terrain, which is okay because I wanted to talk about the terrain. But if I wanted to select the plane, then I could click on that grid there, because the plane is grid icon, the wireframe icon for the plane is larger than the terrain. But if I wanted to select the plane and the terrain was exactly the same size as the plane, there might be a bit of a conflict. I mean, I could click on that now, I'm clicking and I can't get hold of the terrain. I've only got hold of the plane because that's selected. So to get over that, if you hold the control key down while clicking, you get this little context sensitive menu that allows you to determine what you're selecting. So in this case I'll go back to terrain and make the point I was going to make, which is if you edit the terrain, you get the terrain editing canvas here, and that is the north. In its default state, when the terrain comes in, it's aligned so that that's the north. So if you've positioned your camera facing north, then it makes it easier to draw things on the terrain canvas and know how roughly they're going to appear in the wireframe view. Of course, once you've started rotating this, then anything there, if you wanted it there, you would have to put it there because you've rotated it around 90 degrees. If you want to reset the any object back to its default scaling, you hold Control and Alt key down, find one of these control nodes, and you'll see now it shows a 1, and then just clicking on that will spin it back round and put it back into its default scaling. So if you'd scaled it up and did that, Control and Alt down together, click on that, it'd be back to its original scaling that it came in on. So that's probably an aside from what I was going to talk about, but it's worth knowing. So let's assign some families, colours to the different objects in this scene. So I'll left click on the camera and then click on this colourful blob here, and then I'm going to assign it this blue colour, which I rather like, and I'm going to write the name in for that. It's a good idea to get used to naming things in your scene because it'll make things easier when your scenes become more complex. So now when I go to this, it says camera next to the blue colour. So here, this one, click on that, and I'll call this one ground, and here, holding the control key down, select terrain and give that this family here a green colour and call that terrain. You can use any words you want in there, but be aware that there's a limitation on how long a name you can put in before it runs out of space on the little menu there. So to select each of these in turn, just click on that and it will go to select the appropriate one. If you have, I'll create another terrain, 2 terrains, Then when you've assigned it its family grouping and you click on terrain, it's selected both of them. Now this little control here, called the VCR control, and I don't use this very much, but we'll cover its use, allows you to cycle through what you've got selected of that type. So in this case, that's cycling through the object types. I've only got one ground, so it's only selected one ground. That's the terrains. So if the terrains are selected, I can next of type, and then it'll switch between two. But if I had three, so I'll create another one, and it doesn't have to be assigned the same family group. So supposing this was, I made some sea, so I use that to create some wave effect. So that's a different sort of terrain. These could be ground terrains. This terrain could have water material applied to it and be made to look like a sea. Then I could select by this method, so I can have the terrains which would probably have the same material on, sea which have a different material on. I could use this control to cycle through the different types of things, which is essentially cycling along this little bottom menu here. So if I select here terrain, that selects all the terrains, and then I could use this control to cycle from each one in turn. So that's okay, that's quite handy, though to be fair I don't use it very much. The control I use more often, apart from families, is this selection option. So I'll just switch to the camera view because there's a thing here that I want to make you aware of. So here we are, the camera view. I'll just pull the camera back so we can see some of the things in the scene. Okay, right. So if I select this one here and go into this little arrow here, it brings up this menu. Inverse selection's quite handy, so if I've got that selected and then go inverse, that's selected everything else in the scene, but you'll note not the perspective camera. That's been left out of that selection. Back in here we have got the option to select the camera from this view, and if you look now, it's selected, and if you switch views it's got become unselected again. So select it, and those are the controls for the camera. Can't see the edges of the camera unless you use a very wide field of view. So that's actually the camera object we're seeing from inside our viewpoint, which is where these dotted lines converge, because that represents the field of view of the camera. So normally that's not visible to you in this perspective camera view, but if you select camera then you can make it visible. But the control will remain there even if you zoomed in, so it's just on the edge, and that allows you to modify the camera attributes from this view. I don't tend to do that very often because I forget I've got that control and usually end up selecting it overhead. This another option for selection is dragging and dropping, so that's holding the left mouse button down and dragging it over, and that just selects whatever happened to be in that box at the time, the origin of the object in that box at the time. So I'll demonstrate that while I think about it. Okay, so let's zoom in on this a little bit here, not that. So that hand control there allows me to slide the wireframe view around. I suppose I should tell you that. So if I drag and drop but don't include the origin, it doesn't select. So if I included the origin, which is there, that's the center of the object. Now don't know the answer to this, but I suppose it's worth trying. So I'll go to the attributes, create origin as a handle, and then that's a green dot there. I'll just drag the origin outside the box and see if no. So it's not the origin as far as its rotation is concerned, it's the center of the object. So I just thought I'd clarify that. Even for myself, I didn't know the answer to that. Something else I didn't know the answer to, and I've got an empty version of Bryce to demonstrate this. This VCR control, as we were looking at this little menu here, there's an alternative VCR mode. If you switch to the alternative VCR mode, there's little instructions appear here, which is a little bit awkward because it's miles away from where I'm using the control, but there is a floating tip there. Next family and next object. Now if you click on that and you've changed to alternative mode, that happens, which is obviously less helpful, so don't do that. Okay, back to where we were and not crashing Bryce. This control here, I didn't know what it did until today, until I started researching the various options that were available to us. But if you select some things and then press this button here, they vanish. Not the things that you've selected, the other things that were in the scene, which is I don't know how useful that is. I've never noticed this control before or tried using it. So not only do they vanish in the wireframe, they vanish in the render. So I could see there would be some applications for that when you were building very complicated scenes. I'll put those back now. What else have we got? Well, I'm going to bring in an object that I've made. Okay, so there's a little object I've made, and that's been grouped together. So that's made of several objects grouped together, which relates to these submenus here. So we've got groups. We can select all groups, and there's group 1 and insect body groups, which is this grouping here, which is obviously some kind of Boolean operation that I've used to cut the hollows out for the legs to fit in. To group objects is quite simple. You just select the objects you want to group, and you can group them. Now it's created another group, which means in the selection, select groups, we've got group 1 and group 2. Obviously, names like group 1 and group 2 won't be very helpful when it comes to complex scenes. So if you click on the group, you can modify the attributes here and give it a more appropriate name. Group of ground and terrain, for example, would work. And then when you go to select groups, you've got group of ground and terrain. As before, there's obviously only a limited amount of space within this little selection menu, so if you use very long names, they'll become truncated, and the first part of the name's the same. So if you were doing a long name, so group of ground and terrain something, and then a number, the number at the end would be chopped off, so you wouldn't be able to recognize one from the other. So keep the names fairly short, and the identifying bit that changes at the front if you're going to have longer names. At least there's a limitation to how much you can put in this tribute box. So if we go, see, it's already stopped typing. Now, that shows you what your limitation is, and I don't think all of that can be displayed. So you can see now that's created some weird symbols on the end there, just to be aware of that. Okay, right, what else can we do? Select meshes, and then you've got these meshes which have been named all the same thing, which is not very helpful. Supposing then, we've got a few things in this scene now, I wanted to select several of these objects in and out of the groups. So we could do control and then select an insect leg. But if I select another insect leg now, then the first insect leg's deselected. So if I want to select multiple things, so I left click with the control button held down and then hold the shift key down while doing this next click, like so, that allows me to select two objects at the same time. Then I can modify their material attributes together or do something else with them. You will notice, because they're already in a group, then you don't have the option down here to group them again. So if you find you're in a situation where you can't get two things to group, then look in the attributes and make sure that they're not already either grouped or linked in some way that creates, because you don't want to create a paradoxical situation. Bryce prevents you from making something a parent and then grouping it with something that eventually leads around in a loop so it becomes its own parent. That's not allowed, because that would be crazy. So that you might find when you're grouping things and organising your scene that things won't group, then you just need to be aware you might have included it in another group or created another kind of relationship with an object that prevents that from happening, because it would create a paradox. Right, where was I? Oh yeah, selection. So the shift control, I'll just click on that and ungroup it, can also be used in this view. So if I left click on that terrain and then I want to select that one as well, just hold the shift key down and click on it, and that gives you both of them selected, which would allow you to change the family grouping of them together, for example. So I can change them both to blue. You'll notice that when both of them were selected, it's showing family group blue there, and then if I select a different one, it is black in this colour there, so not grey, which is the default one. Likewise, groups can also be given a family allocation, but if you do that, everything in the subgroups will receive that allocation as well. So if you want them to be different from the group allocation, you have to go in and modify them separately. So you can have a position where you've got the group with one family allocation and then one part of it with different ones, but you have to do the grouping colour first and then do the things inside that group afterwards. Otherwise, if you carefully name all your parts and then make them all part of the same thing, you'll have problems because they'll all be reset. Likewise with naming, with these terrains, we can name them all together to give them the same name. So we'll go to General here and all the same name, and that will apply it to each one in turn, so they'll all have the same name, which can then, we can't select it like that, but if there were meshes like you saw with the legs, it becomes a bit awkward because you can't determine which one belongs to what bit of the object, which is why you need the control key so you can select out different parts. Right, have I covered everything? I'm not really sure. This allows you to select by type, that allows you to cycle through the type. Don't select alternative VCR mode unless you want Bryce to crash. We've done the selection of camera, select meshes, select groups. Never use that, select web links, in fact I don't know how to make one. Select none's quite handy. After you've got a few things selected, just select none. Select all, obviously, if you're doing it from this view, the perspective camera will not be included. But, I was going to mention here, under the camera control options, you have an edit current camera, which allows you to get straight to that dialogue that I pulled up before, and you'll see it's also put a bit of graphics with it, but not to worry about that. So you have that option as well for selecting the camera. Other than that, let's see, we cycle through selecting object types. You know, I think that's more or less as much as I know about selecting objects. There are other controls here to change the display mode from the default wireframe for these other OpenGL modes, and all I would say about this is the good for careful alignment of different components, but the selection operates slightly differently, and I've never had a lot of success in getting on with this selection mode. So now, see, I can't move that part, I can only move it with this control. I can't actually get hold of it and drag it in this view, it just won't have it. So this is why I never really bothered with this. It does sometimes work with some things, but once they're grouped it seems to not work so well, so there's just a bit of a word of warning there. I tend to use the default wireframe view anyway, because this is something I could mention. In the switching views again. Right, in the default wireframe view, you forgot these options that allow you to change that LOD's level of detail. It's selecting its own for certain things, so it can put boxes when your scene gets very complicated. But each of these controls here allow you to change the resolution of the wireframe according to whether you're dragging it and moving it, it's in your scene as these things are now, or it's selected, which is when it's red. So when it's selected, it can have a different resolution to when it's just static. So I just tend to stick with the same thing. Another thing that happens with these controls is this selected one determines up to a point the resolution of the converted meshes. So if you create a couple of objects here, copy and paste, and select them both, go into the attributes, I'll make them positive, do a Boolean operation, so that's group and convert. The conversion process generates a mesh object in the wireframe that can be file export object here. So while it exists in the render, which you can't really see because I put the sun right in front of us, if it exists in the render, it's using the Bryce primitives in the render. When you export it, it exports this mesh it's represented here in the wireframe, and the resolution of that mesh up to a point is determined by this value that's for the selected. It doesn't go over 64, I think. I can't quite remember, I'd have to check the bug tracker for that, but that's just a side note, you can experiment with that. The process can be a bit flaky, that's the only thing I would say about that. I don't know if it's worth mentioning this at this point, but since I've started, if you create an object here, we'll do a similar thing, but we'll do it so it's an exclusion of everything else. So here's our sphere, and I'll copy and paste it, and then I'll go attributes and positive, and then group it. If I convert it at this point, that's still sort of a group. The mesh objects do exist somewhere, obviously, because we can export them, but they're not shown in the render. It's using the Bryce primitives that I used. But if I create another group, because there is sort of a group, and I'll copy and paste that and just group that, So I've grouped those together, and then I hold the control key down and select this group. Because that first one was grouped, I get the option to ungroup it again because it's a proper group. This group is not a proper group anymore because it's been converted, but it really is a group at some level. So if I select this group and then select that group in turn and then ungroup, it breaks the system because that shouldn't be allowed. That's an operation that isn't allowed. So the point is, don't do that, because that's now created an object that we can see in the render that we can no longer select. It's become a non-object. We can't select it, export it, or do anything with it. So you just need to be aware of these few little foibles of Bryce when sorting your scene out, because you don't want to create things like this because it was likely to lead to some kind of issue later on when you save your scene, because it's entered a bug state. So yeah, I've gone on a bit there and I didn't really mean to. Sorry about that. That in essence is everything that I think I know about selecting objects and organising your scene. As somebody who doesn't really generate very complex scenes, mostly focused on a few elements, then I can't really only give you any deep advice about making massively complex scenes, but the elements are there in terms of these controls and family grouping and naming the objects appropriately as you bring them into your scene, and that's what I would recommend you do. Provide a family group name your objects, and then as you build your scene bit by bit, you're less likely to get in a position where you've got loads of wireframe objects stacked on top of one another and you can't really figure out how to get hold of the object you want to modify next, which is frustrating. So avoid that situation, plan ahead, move your camera around so it's facing north, and build your scene bit by bit. If you find, as you've built a complex scene with a lot of things in the wireframe, Bryce starts getting a bit sluggish in showing you the wireframe view. Oh yeah, here's something. Okay, right. Attributes, you can select show as box. So if you've got complex wireframe objects, you show them as boxes, and this will allow things to be sped up in the wireframe view. And obviously it reduces the load on what it's got to draw every time you move the camera and that kind of thing, because if this starts getting a bit chunky and sluggish, then it becomes irritating. And obviously you want to, since you've spent a lot of time building your scene, you want that process to be as smooth as possible and the whole experience to be as enjoyable as possible. And if you're having to switch view and then wait for it to update the wireframe view, it just becomes annoying and not fun. Oh, another thing I thought of. This control here, underground on off, will clip the objects at the ground plane. So you can see that sphere has been clipped off. It's not really been clipped off, it's just that it's not showing anything underneath the 0 point on the attributes here. So that's origin slightly below 0, and you can put it entirely below 0 and then you can't get hold of it again once you've done that. So if you get in that position, if you change view, you can see it's also gone, so it can look like these things have vanished. You just click that control and you can get hold of it again. The shadows give you a clue because they appear at the 0 point. Come on, dragon. Why can't I drag you up? It's been difficult now. Get hold of that. Right. And lift it up. The shadows give you a clue as to what the 0 point is on the origin, so that's just a bit of a help there. Oh. Okay, right, last thing is, there is another control in this wireframe view, the default wireframe view, that allows you to determine how far away things are by using a graded scale to fade out the wireframe as I'm just putting things further away from the camera. I think is it this control? No, it's wireframe shadows on off. Okay, that's another control. It's this control here, Q depth. I find this very useful. This, sorry, depth Q, that's my dyslexia. If you left click on that and you drag up and down, then it'll change the rate at which it fades it to white colour. So if you just set it so you can see that the foreground objects are more densely coloured in than the background objects, which is a really handy feature, I think. So, and it works for all the different family groupings as well. So that's just helps you determine, because if you'd make these spheres were scaled so they were all the same size in this view, then or there was a larger sphere, then the size of the sphere, the perspective on it, wouldn't give you a clue as to how far away the object was. So it might look like that one was closer. But with the depth cue set right, you can see that that one's further away and that one's closer. So, okay, that really is it. That's the end of the tutorial. I hope that wasn't too boring for you.